When I was a kid, I was on this show called Jerry's Place. The show has basically been erased from the public's consciousness, so don't rack your brain if you don't remember it. We worked for a small Canadian studio, hoping to market the show to an American audience. Half of Season 1 never even aired in Canada, not after the incident. The show followed a fairly typical formula. There was a father and a mother character, wise yet silly parents, who dispensed advice and hugs in equal parts. An older sibling who was aloof and angsty and brought friends over to add color to our small cast. The two younger siblings, one of them very young and the other around 9 or 10, who were there to make hijinks and generally move the story along. The later was me. I was the middle child, and I was usually responsible for comic relief or having some part in the week's story. The two adult characters were Linda and Mike, and they were actually pretty cool. Mike was a lifelong actor who always had a word of advice or a smile if you felt scared. As someone who grew up without a father, Mike was the person I used as a model for what a man should be, though it probably became intertwined with his character on the show to a certain degree. Linda was great too, a mom with kids of her own who was always looking after us when we weren't shooting on set and making sure that we got enough to eat. My own mother was working 2 jobs to keep the lights on at home, so there were evenings where I would join Linda and her children for family dinners until my mom could pick me up. Linda and Mike were almost like surrogate parents to me during that time of my life, and Rachel and Mark almost became like adopted siblings. Rachel was the older sister, angsty and above it all on camera, but she was always very nice off screen. Rachel would run lines with me when I was scared, and always helped me when I needed something. She was actually 19, though she played a 16-year-old, and on the nights when Linda couldn't take me, I would hang out with Rachel until my mom came and picked me up. Mark, the younger boy, was 6, and we weren't too far off in age, really. We had similar interests, and we would often sit around off screen and talk about Ninja Turtles or Power Rangers, or play Game Boys together. In many ways, those 5 people became family to me for that year and a half. It makes the rest of the story all the harder to tell. It was a typical day of shooting. We had finished what would have been Season 1, and were shooting some scenes for Season 2. The network had been pleased with our viewership so far, so a second season seemed to be in the cards. With the second season, though, came a live audience. This was the 90s, and live audiences were all the rage. The first season had been live a few times, for select episodes, but this season would have a live audience throughout. The presence of an audience was a bit of a distraction, and often led to Mark and I playing it up a little bit for their attention. We had been asked to ignore them, but we were young, and the laughter of adults meant a lot to us. We were in episode 6 of Season 2, when a very different audience wandered in. I remember it perfectly. The event gouged into my mind surgically. We were setting up for the opening scene when the stage door opened and a crowd of people filed in. There were about 20 of them in all. Our audiences tended to be small, and I can remember not seeing any kids or strollers as they filed into the dark rows. Our show was loved by people of all ages. You could usually count on a few kids being in the live audience during recording. Usually they brought the house lights up, allowing us to see the audience, but today the crowd sat in shadow. Mark whispered to me about it, saying they looked a little creepy, all huddled up in the dark like that. I told him it was probably just something new the directors were doing to make us ignore them. We set up for the shot, and I found myself looking at the crowd out of the corner of my eye. It wasn't that dark out there. Not really. But the whole audience sat in a small sea of shadows that seemed to crowd around them. They didn't talk. They didn't shuffle. They just hunched there and waited for us to begin. We rolled the opening. Jerry's Place is filmed before a live studio audience. And away we went. As Mike came on stage, the titular Jerry, I had expected the crowd to clap as they usually did when a character came onto scene. They didn't, though. They just sat there, waiting. The director looked back at them and shrugged, whispering something to his assistant. Mike looked up at the audience strangely too, but he was a pro and didn't let it mess him up. Linda and Rachel, Megan and Bonnie on the show, were watching TV as Mike walked in from the kitchen and delivered his lines. They cued Mark and me to run downstairs and begin the show's problem, a broken toy that was important to me. By the end of the show, Mark would have saved enough money to buy me a new one, and I would learn a lesson about sharing. Everyone at home would feel warm and fuzzy as my brother and I hugged it out, and the show would end on a high note. At least, that's how it should have gone. I came downstairs yelling about my toy, a model airplane, and Mark was right behind me in typical little brother fashion. Mike looked at the plane and asked if I couldn't just use it like this, as I hit my mark and prepared to deliver my character's catchphrase. Catchphrases were prominent in the 90s. They were also very marketable, and my catchphrase was supposed to elicit laughs from the audience. Until then, they had just been sitting quietly. I wish maybe they had stayed quiet. Play with a broken toy? That's gonna be a deal breaker for me, Pops, I said, looking at the audience as I did so. That's when they started to laugh. I was expecting a chuckle, maybe even a full-fledged laugh or two. The audience surprised me by emanating a hearty, canned laughter, the kind you hear on sitcoms when the real audience might be too much. Mike started to give his next line, but the audience just kept laughing. I looked at them, my face still holding that mischievous smile that it always did after my catchphrase, and saw that the shadowy crowd was laughing and heaving in unison. The shadowy mob was hitching and chuckling as one being, and as I watched, I felt my smile faltering. Mike tried to give his next line again, but the laughter overtopped him. The director said something to his assistant, and the man brought out a cue card that read, "Quiet, please." He held it high, right in front of the audience, but they just kept on laughing. Their laughter had begun to make me uneasy. The longer they laughed, the more uniform and unchanging their laughter became. It should have been impossible for someone to laugh like that for that long, but they laughed through it. The laughter never rose or fell in volume, just the mad, canned laughter I would become familiar with later in life. It was emotionless and inhuman, and it just continued to pour out of them as they huddled in the shadows. The assistant shouted at the crowd then, the director calling for the cameras to be cut. One of the cameramen, I can't remember his name, but he was always kind of a jokester, turned the camera to film the crowd. Maybe he thought it would be great for a gag reel or something. Perhaps he thought the studio was playing a joke on us. But whatever he was thinking, he had an excellent seat for what happened next. When the assistant's shouts failed to gain any attention, he walked into the seats and started yelling at the crowd. That's when his angry shouts turned into overwhelming laughter, and he too started chuckling. The director turned and started shouting at the crowd to be quiet, even as he shouted at his assistant to come down. We had all started milling about close to our marks so we could start again. I couldn't help but notice Rachel and Linda on the couch, and how Linda had a protective arm around her. They looked scared, and despite being trained to stay close to our marks, I went over and sat with them, wanting to be in that protective bubble. A stagehand had gone into the audience to get the assistant back, but now he was sitting and chuckling right along with the rest of them. It was that same canned laughter, but they sounded like lunatics now. They were consistent, unchanging in pitch or fervor, and it was all becoming too spooky for me. Mark came and sat beside me, and I wrapped a brotherly arm around him just as Linda had. "I don't like it. They're scaring me," Mark cried as big tears rolled down his cheek. I told him that I was pretty scared too, and when Mike came up to put his hand on the back of the couch, I felt safe knowing that he was there. As we sat and watched, another stagehand went up. He grasped the first one by the arm, pulling at him as he tried to get him to leave, but soon he too was laughing and grinning as he took a seat beside the other one. After that, the director forbade anyone else to go up. The crew sat huddled together on the edge of the stage as they tried to figure out what was happening. The director sent a stagehand to get security, but the stagehand found the doors to be locked. None of the keys would open them, and he came back white-faced, skirting the audience, as if whatever they had might be catching. The director sent someone to see if the roof access was open, but they discovered the same thing. Keys didn't work, and the hatch was locked. Someone tried a landline in the back, but found no dial tone. This was before cell phones had become a norm, but the director had a bag phone that he tried. Same thing, no dial tone, no call would go out. And all the while, they laughed. Even after an hour, they still just laughed. The director and some of the crew had come to sit around the couch. They had brought items from the food service table, and we all just kind of had a picnic. It would have been nice had the creepy laughing shadow people not been staring at us the whole time. As we ate, I noticed that some of the crew had stayed away and seemed to be eating on the outskirts. They kept looking at the crowd, some of them staring, and when I asked the director about them, he shook his head. One of them claims that his father is sitting in the audience. "What?" Mike asked, his mouth full of sandwich. "He says the man in the front row near the middle is his father. He says it can't be him, because he died of lung cancer last year, but it definitely looks like him. He says that the laughing man will look at him every now and again and try to wave him over. He knows he shouldn't go, but he says that it's hard not to go every time the guy waves at him." "That's nuts," Linda breathed. Each of them has a story like that, the director said. For Carrie, he pointed to the redhead with the ponytail, it's her girlfriend who left for New Mexico and never came back. For Steve, he pointed to the guy with the salt and pepper crew cut, it's his sister who stopped talking to him after his parents left him everything in their will. They all have someone, all of them thinking they might, but as he spoke, we saw Carrie get up and take a step towards the chuckling crowd. Steve grabbed at her, but she shrugged him off and walked towards the crowd like someone in a dream. She embraced one of the shadowy masses and then sat next to them, chuckling and smiling as her butt pressed into the seat. After Steve left too, the director decided to take action. He told one of the hands near us to turn on the house lights. He wanted lights on the crowd so we could see who they were. Maybe they would stop laughing if their covers were blown, and this would be all over, and we could all get back to work. He still seemed to think that this might be a prank, though not a very funny one, and wanted an end to it already. Some of the stage hands went to get things set up, but we all kept looking at that quietly chuckling behemoth. Mark had fallen asleep somehow, and I kept my arm wrapped around him as though I might stand between him and the tide should they change. I was still munching absent-mindedly at fruit from the food table, and I didn't notice Rachel getting up until my bowl of honeydew almost tipped over. Linda grabbed her wrist, anchoring her to the couch, but I could see that her eyes were big and starry when I looked up. Her blonde hair bobbed a little as she scanned the crowd, and Linda started asking her what she was looking for. I saw someone up there, someone I haven't seen in a very long... But she gasped harshly and said, It's him! It's him! Oh my God! She was pulling against Linda's hand, but Linda refused to let her go. Who, Rachel? Who is it? Linda asked, trying to restrain the girl as Mike moved to help. It's my dad! My dad's up there! He looks just like he did on the photo Mom has on her dresser. He hasn't changed a bit. I looked at the crowd, trying to see who she was talking about, but failed. Rach, your dad died when you were born. Your mother told me about the accident. It can't be him. But it is, Rachel almost screamed, pitching her body from side to side as she tried to break free. Mike and Linda held her tightly, and I scooted closer to Mark so Mike could sit on the couch. The two of them sat there and held her as she sobbed for them to let her go. She used a lot of swear words as she thrashed about, but they refused to let go of her. When she finally stopped, she sat crying into Linda's shoulder as the two of them hugged her tightly. Someone yelled down from the catwalk then, and the stage was suddenly awash with light. The overheads were unbearably bright, and as they were all lit at once, I remember tinting my eyes with my hands so I didn't go blind. We had used them for a beach scene a few times when rain caused us not to shoot on location, and I can remember thinking that they were so much brighter than the real sun. They lit up every corner of the set, but I realized I had been wrong as I squinted at the seats. Every corner but that one, it seemed. The seats were still in a pool of shadow, but when the light hit them, everything changed. The low chuckling became a strange hybrid of screaming and deep booming laughter, the kind of laughter you heard in an insane asylum, the kind of laughter you heard in hell. The people in the seats never moved, but the darkness did. It plumed out like a fog and started rolling towards us. Those sitting near the seats were hit, and I could hear them laughing as they fell to their knees and clutched their stomachs. The director shouted at the crew to kill the lights, but it was much too late. The darkness was angry now, and it was no longer satisfied with the few people it had in the seats. It was coming for us. Mike grabbed Mark and I, lifting us up in his strong arms, and started running backstage. He turned to yell at Linda as she fought with Rachel, the girl trying to free herself again. She was straining towards the fog, and it was creeping in to get both of them. Mike yelled for her to let Rachel go if she wouldn't come, but Linda refused to leave her there. She strained and pulled at the girl, but Rachel was apparently stronger than she looked. It didn't matter a moment later as the fog rolled in, and they were both little more than chuckling shadows. Mike ran to the back, Mark crying and asking what was going on. He had woken up when Mike picked him up, and Mike was looking frantically for some way to escape. Mike saw a window and lifted a piece of wood to smash it out. As he brought the wood down, however, he might as well have been hitting concrete, because the board bounced off, splinters flying. The dark fog was rolling past the set walls now, and Mike was almost out of options. Mark and I just stood there, eyes roving around like scared dogs, trying to make sense of what was happening. Finally, Mike settled on a closet. It was full of brooms and mops, but we didn't have time to move any at that point. Mike pushed us in and sighed as he saw how much room was left. As the fog plumed behind him, he slammed the door and left us in total darkness. His laughter started a few minutes later, and the sound nearly drove us mad as we huddled in the tiny closet. Mark and I hunched, arms wrapped around each other, expecting that we would both begin to laugh any minute. We sat like that for a long time. I have no idea how long exactly, but both of us fell asleep to the sound of Mike's choking laughter. When I woke up, I was in a hospital. My mother was asleep in the chair next to my bed. I got the whole story a few days later. My mother didn't know much, but she had come to the set only to find all the doors locked and police trying to get in. Once they had gotten in, some of them started laughing and couldn't stop. The paramedics and the fire department had come. After searching the place with breathing equipment, they found Mark and I and brought us safely out. There was nothing wrong with either of us, not physically, but the two of us had been catatonic for the last 3 days. The man from the studio, the one in the pristine suit and the oiled hair, told me a very different story. He said that it was some kind of gas leak, and claimed that most of those present had been hallucinating due to the gas. The audience, cast and crew had all died due to gas inhalation, and Mark and I had been lucky to survive. Our parents had both signed non-disclosure agreements. We would promise not to talk about anything in exchange for a large amount of financial compensation. My mother and I needed the money, now that the show was going to be canceled. Both our parents signed, and Mark and I went our separate ways. The whole event was deemed a tragic accident, and I never worked in showbiz again. That would be the end of the story, if it weren't for the email I received a week ago. I'm in my 30s now, and about a week ago, I got a Facebook request from Mark. I'd expected that he wanted to catch up, have a beer, and share some old stories, but his first message was far from what I expected. He sent me a message a few seconds later, and after accepting, he sent me 7 words. Are they still laughing for you, too? We met up for that beer the next day. Mark was older, but far from doing well. The guy looked rough, borderline homeless, and seemed eternally looking around to see who was near him. He asked if I still heard the laughter. I told him I hadn't, not since that day all those years ago. He said that for him, it had never stopped. He would wake up to see shadowy figures at the end of his bed, that canned laughter bubbling from their dark lips. He said Rachel and Linda and Mike were right out front, 2 white teeth smiling as they laughed and laughed. His parents hadn't believed him. They thought it was just bad dreams because of the incident. The drugs the shrink gave him just meant that he was a drooling zombie, as the laughing apparitions chuckled on and on. He started using young. First it was alcohol. His dad had a cabinet in the living room. Then drugs when he was in high school. He stole prescription medication, used blends of different drugs, drank himself into oblivion, but nothing helped. Every night they were waiting for him. Every night he screamed until they disappeared with the light of day or the arrival of someone else. Just wanted to see if you'd found a way to make them stop too, big brother, he said sadly as he left the bar. He killed himself a week later. Put a gun in his mouth, and the rest is pretty easy to figure out. I envy him now. I envy that he had the strength to do what needed to be done. About a week ago, I woke up to the sound of that canned laughter that always creeped me out in sitcoms. I fumbled for the remote, thinking I'd just left the TV on, but as the TV came to life, I saw them. They were arrayed at the foot of my bed, their bodies made of living darkness, made all the murkier by the light of the TV, and their laughter went on and on. Mark was among them, his unkempt hair now a raven mane of living shadow. Mike was there too, and Linda, and Rachel, all of them laughing and laughing as I lay in bed, frozen in terror. They left with the sun, and I got up to write this. I don't know how long I can take this. I'm afraid to go to sleep, afraid to see them, but I'm too afraid to take Mark's way out. I see him amongst them, laughing and laughing like an audience in hell, and I wonder if I'll join them at the end too. I'm afraid to go to sleep, afraid to be awake, afraid to see their faces, and afraid of running into them again. My eyes are getting heavy. The 4th cup of coffee is jittering in my hand. I wonder if it hurts to laugh forever. Perhaps I'll find out soon. "Hey, Four Eyes," Marcus yelled, and I winced as I heard his sneakers smacking the linoleum. Marcus and I are far from friends. I've known Marcus since my family moved here when I was 8. My first interaction with him was on the playground on my first day of school. Marcus and his small band of cronies wandered up to me as I sat in the sandbox, clearly drawn over by the new kid, and made the dynamic of our future relationship very clear. I had sand kicked in my face, a sneaker pressed to my chest, and before I knew it, I was on my back in the sandbox, as Marcus informed me that he would be collecting my lunch money from now on, and there wasn't a thing I could do about it. As I lay there staring up at him, without a teacher in sight to help me, I knew at 8 that I was truly helpless. For the next 8 years, I brought my lunch. For the next 8 years, he took this as a personal challenge to make my life a living hell. My lunches were stolen, my glasses were broken, my things were vandalized, and my friends and I were tormented by the ever-present shadow of Marcus Hines. I did make friends, of course, but many people avoided me simply because I had elicited the ire of Marcus. He was a constant presence in my life. He was always there, always looming, always waiting for his next opportunity to show me what I was, his constant victim. I never owned anything that he didn't try to destroy or take away from me. I never liked a girl that he didn't immediately woo and dump in a semester. Marcus made it his business to have anything that I wanted but couldn't afford, so he could rub it in my face. I kept hoping, just as Mother had always taught me, that karma would catch up with him, and his actions would be punished by the ever-present force of cosmic justice. It seemed, however, that karma was not on my side. As we grew, Marcus became the darling of whatever school he attended, and I became known as a bit of a weirdo. I was a quiet kid. I liked to write. My grades were fine, but I was an introvert, and I didn't like to show off in class. Marcus, on the other hand, was known and loved by all. I quickly learned that this was how he got away with his bullying. Marcus was large, imposing, but he had a way about him that endeared him to adults. I would never admit it to him, but he was also smart. He never had trouble with grades, never had to study for tests, and seemed to succeed with only minimal effort. He played sports through school and thrived on the field just as much as he did in the classroom. By the time we were seniors, he had a football scholarship that would let him go to nearly any school he wanted. He was a typical all-American student, and the world was his oyster. I hated him, especially after what he did to me. I had spent 3 years with one goal in mind, having a seat on the student council at my senior year. It would look great on my college transcripts, alongside my volunteer work and debate team presence. Also, I thought I could actually make a difference for some of the unheard students at the school. On a deeper level, I realized it might also bring me out of my shell and change me a little before leaving this whole experience behind and going on to college. I had lived my life as an introvert, not really wanting to know anyone outside my circle of friends. Senior year was my chance to really experience what would become the best years of my life, or so they said. Maybe putting myself out there would change me a little, perhaps even for the better. I had such high hopes back then. I had campaigned, talked to a few of my fellow students, and felt that I had my finger on the pulse of what they wanted in a councilman. I seemed a shoo-in for the empty seat. That wasn't until Marcus realized how much I wanted it. That's when he joined the race. Suddenly, his flyers were in every hall, his posters plastered over mine. His talking points were very similar to mine too, and his platform was nearly identical to my own. He could say what he wanted to his constituents, but his goal seemed to be yet again taking the one thing that I wanted. He'd been trying and failing to throw me off my game for weeks, trying to get in my head and make me drop out of the election before the upcoming candidacy speech, before the student body voted for their representation. As he approached, I wondered if he had found the toehold he needed. I closed my laptop as he came to stand over me, not wanting it broken if he was in a mood to break things. His face was possessed of that mixture of wicked glee and childish meanness. He looked like a kid who was about to pull the wings off a butterfly. I guess he was. I had been his caged bug for years, and today was just another chance to practice his sadism on me. He came alone, but I could see several Letterman jackets hovering nearby, watching the show. I was nowhere near as muscular as him, being on the scrawny side, but that hardly mattered to me. Marcus never fought fair if he could help it. "Guess what I did last night," he shouted, glancing around to see who was watching. My friends, immersed in a game of Magic the Gathering, looked up like startled animals around a watering hole. A predator had arrived, and they wanted to know when the best time to start running would be. "I don't know, Marcus. Something fulfilling and meaningful, but I doubt it," I said, without much interest. Marcus barked out a sarcastic little laugh. "You'd be right there, Four Eyes." He never used my name. It was always Four Eyes, and always in tones of deepest scorn. I was at a rager last night when I met this fine-looking piece of tail and took her upstairs for a few hours. God, she screamed so loud I thought the cops were going to come. "If you're looking for a high five, I think your boys are hovering somewhere over there," I said, already uninterested in the conversation. I had no idea that his trap had teeth, and he was about to show me just how deep they could cut. "I just thought I'd let you know what a good lay your sister was, Four Eyes." She screamed my name again and again as I had her. The whole cafeteria was paying attention now. I glanced at my friends and saw that their game was forgotten as Marcus laid out his night's activities for me in intimate details. My face reddened, the snickers already beginning, and he loudly proclaimed his activities for all to hear. I was shocked. I was incapable of reacting. I simply wanted to stop existing at that very moment. How could she? How could my own flesh and blood betray me so thoroughly? How many nights had I confided in my family about the abuse I suffered at Marcus's hands? How many times had she seen me demoralized at school by this bully? How could she have done such a thing? I don't know how his story ended. I grabbed my bag and ran into the cafeteria, hiding my streaming eyes as I ran blindly for the exit. Someone yelled at me in the hallway, but I didn't stop. I was outside far sooner than I thought I would be, and I heard a car horn blare as I dashed across the parking lot towards my car. I tossed my bag inside, not even caring about the things inside, and was on the road before I knew quite what was happening. My streaming eyes made it difficult to drive, but I knew I couldn't stay there a moment longer. The emotions roiled inside me, and I felt like I might be sick as I drove the streets. There was rage bubbling inside me, an impotent rage that had been festering for years, but had never been fully realized. I hated Marcus, but his actions had been those of a bully seeking a release until this point. It was only then that I realized his intention to hurt. He wasn't content with just hurting me physically anymore. He wanted to break me. I didn't understand his animosity, and I never would. I spent the rest of the day in my room, having a nervous breakdown. My friends didn't text me. No one texted me. As I lay there waiting for someone to reach out to me, I began to feel utterly alone. My anxiety was palpable as I lay in my bed and tried to gain control of myself. Had anyone even noticed I left school? Of course they had. They were just too embarrassed by my outburst to contact me. They didn't want to get caught up in the fallout of my shame. I wouldn't be welcome to sit with my friends anymore. I would be an outcast. My brain reminded me, almost absently, that I could kiss my bid for student council goodbye as well. No one would vote for me now. No one would waste their vote on a loser like me. The candidacy speech was tomorrow. How could I mount that stage with everyone whispering about me? How could I tell them how I would be their voice on the council, with them all laughing at me behind their hands? My mind raced, my pulse raced, and I lay in bed in perpetual anxiety. I must have fallen asleep at some point, my anxiety so bad that I had worn myself out because of it. Because the next thing I knew, someone was knocking on my door. "Hey, Spaz, why'd you leave school?" My blood ran cold. It was her. My sister, Stephanie, was never what you would call a joy. She was 2 years younger than me, a sophomore, but the two of us couldn't have been more different. My sister was the foil to my introvert nature. She was a social butterfly who flew in many circles and knew practically everyone. She was their perfect little girl to my parents. They were utterly unaware of her late-night carousing and extracurricular activities. To them, she was an angel, but to me, she was just a spoiled brat. She was needy to the point of annoyance, her needs turning to indifference when you needed something from her. She had come by to see what she could gain from my suffering. "Go away," I droned, not wanting to see her. She came in instead. Heard Marcus spilled the beans about our night last night. I turned towards the wall, ignoring her. "It was just sex. It's not like we're dating or anything. He's cute and I wanted to sleep with him." I turned over angrily to growl at her. "You slept with someone who has made my life a living hell since I was 8 years old. Do you have any idea how that makes me feel? You've made me into a laughingstock. How can I go back to school and look at Marcus, knowing that he's been with my freaking sister? She smirked, not even having the decency to look ashamed. As if anyone but you cares. Get over yourself. It's my life, and I'll live it any way I want. For the record, he was great, too. She added the last barb before leaving. My mother was furious when she came home from work. Not at my sister, of course. She couldn't believe that people would spread such lies about her perfect little angel. She was furious at me. How could I leave school early? What was I thinking? Didn't I care about my future at all? Skipping classes and being truant was no way to live my life. The sermons went on and on as we sat around the dinner table. My sister was smug, of course, as I sat there being chastised. Dad went right on eating as though the world were just as bland as it always was. To say that Dad didn't care was an understatement. Dad simply didn't want to involve himself in what he called woman's work, and didn't worry his mind about the matters concerning the children. I had started shoveling my food down, barely tasting it, to escape the table and my mother's howling words. With my plate clean, I asked to leave. She wasn't done yelling at me yet, but I told her that I needed to prepare my speech for tomorrow, which seemed to perk her up a little. She had known that I was running. Hadn't they both told me how small a chance someone like me had of being elected? But as I kept at it, I think she realized how much I wanted this. She released me, threatening bodily harm if she ever heard of me leaving school early again, and I was free to return to my room. I spent the rest of the night in a state of anxious tension. A rainstorm rolled in about midnight, and I found myself tossing and turning in a ball of roiling emotions. I didn't dare go to school tomorrow. Marcus would be waiting there. All those people would know about my shame, and they would all laugh at me. I couldn't go back. I couldn't go back. I couldn't. The lightning lit up the sky, and I started out of my bed, looking at the window. Had I seen something? It was impossible. I was on the second story. There was no way I had seen something at my window. My anxiety was creeping up on me now, and it was making me see things, that was all. As the rain came down, I got up and moved closer to the window. The thunder boomed outside, and I crept towards the glass square like a rat trying to avoid detection. There was nothing there. Why was I so jumpy? There was nothing on the other side of the window, but when the lightning flashed again, I screamed and fell onto the carpet. Something was on the other side of the window, an inky face that had been looking at me, and when it saw me looking, it had smiled. Its teeth had been Colgate white, a stark contrast to its midnight personage, and I felt my breath hitching as I stared at that jet-black window. The rain fell against it like angry stones, and I waited in terror for the next flash of lightning. When it flashed, it was gone, though. I curled into a ball on the floor, closing my eyes and trying to will myself to sleep, but all I could see was the nightmare face. I had seen it for the barest of seconds, but it was imposed on my memories forever. I lay on the floor as the lightning struck outside, too afraid to open my eyes, but too scared to sleep either. My anxiety and fear roiled inside me like a tempest, and I spent the rest of the night huddled on the floor, shuddering. Wake up! I must have dozed off sometime before the sun came up. My mother was standing over me, yelling and slapping at me as the sun shone merrily through the window. My mother was rousing me, telling me I was going to be late. I stirred groggily and went to my closet to get out the clothes I would wear for the speech today. I was too groggy for the anxiety to hit me all at once, but as I started getting dressed, I remembered the roiling pit of dread in my stomach and stopped with my slacks halfway up. I couldn't go to school. I'd have to face the mob alone. My mother came in with a cup of coffee and a plate of eggs, frowning as she saw me shaking and indecisive. All my excuses, though, fell on deaf ears. I was not missing school today, no matter what was wrong, and that was that. She would take me and drop me off herself if it came to it. I was not ruining my education because of something silly that had happened the day before. People would always be stupid, and I wasn't going to ruin my future over it. In the end, I took the cup of coffee and left just to escape her venom. As I drove, I honestly felt like I might be having a nervous breakdown. The coffee shook in my hand, and if Mom hadn't put it in a to-go cup, I would have undoubtedly spilled it on my pants as I drove. I looked up in time to see the light turn red, slamming on my brakes just a minute too late and getting a nasty look from a jogger running across the road. I tracked her dully with my eyes and jumped when she ran past an overhang near the deli. The coffee flew out of my hand and hit the passenger window, exploding in a caffeine puddle over the glass. The passers-by looked at me concerned as the drops slid down the glass, but I was already running the red light and speeding towards the school. My heart raced and my stomach flipped over, my anxiety about the speech and the bully momentarily forgotten. Under the awning, perched in the shadow, had been two of those oily black things that had appeared in my window the night before. Their skin had oozed with midnight clarity, but their smiles were wide and crazed. As I drove, I thought I could see others, pairs and threesomes, foursomes, all watching me from the shadows of alleys and the dark respites of awnings and doorways. They were following me. They wanted me, but I did not want to be found by them. I had reminded myself not to speed. I had to remind myself to stop at stop signs and red lights. I did not want to be pulled over. I did not want to stop until I was somewhere with people and lights and places to hide from them. At that point, I would have welcomed the jeers of my schoolyard rabble. I pulled into the parking lot just as the first bell rang. The halls were packed, the students making last-minute preparations and finishing their conversations around lockers. But when they recognized me, I heard a definite change in the tempo of the conversations. "Oh my God, isn't his sister the one who... I feel so bad for him. I don't know how he came to school after... Oh man, Marcus totally owned his ass yesterday. Told the whole world his sister's a... And he just ran away." I walked fast, not talking, not stopping, just wanting to get to my homeroom amidst the gale of gossip. I heard someone laugh, but I didn't dare look. It sounded fake anyway, like teasing laughter, more like the canned laughter on TV shows than real laughter. The hallway became a gauntlet, people staring, people laughing. Amongst them, I became sure that I could see those black creatures that had hounded me all the way here. They slipped among them, staying in the shadows, and whoever they touched seemed to smile and titter. I wanted to run. I could feel tears on the verge of breaking the surface, but I didn't want to draw more attention. The laughter was so snide, so fake, that I almost couldn't stand it. It rattled against my nerves, and it made me want to scream. I rounded a corner, still making for my homeroom, and bumped into someone. I threw my hands up defensively, almost certain that it would be one of those tar creatures with their smiling mouths. Instead, it was Miss Cunningham, the assistant principal. She looked put upon, her normally well-maintained pantsuit and lustrous black hair looking rumpled and out of place. I wondered if she, too, hadn't slept well last night. She huffed when she realized who she had run into, and tapped her foot impatiently. "I was beginning to think you weren't coming today. You're speaking second. Marcus was on time, so he gets to speak first, and it starts in 5 minutes. I suggest you hurry." She turned and started for the gymnasium. I could hear that repulsive laughter behind me, heard it creeping up the corridors like a cancerous cloud, and I sped off behind her, not wanting it to catch me. The gym was packed. The entire senior class was assembled. Any excuse to miss first period, I supposed, and they were murmuring quietly in the hard bleachers that had been pulled out for the occasion. As I came in, someone noticed me, and the whispering conversations began again. I heard some snickers, felt their stares, and knew that they knew my shame. My stomach was a roil of angry emotions. My brain was befuddled and unsure of what was real anymore. I was on the verge of a nervous breakdown, my whole life hanging by a fiber before entirely imploding. I had no clue how much worse it could get. "About time you showed up, Four Eyes," Marcus said, looking resplendent in a suit and tie that had clearly been tailored for him. I didn't say anything. My attention was on the crowd. I could see the creatures amongst them, whispering and gnashing those perfect teeth against their ears. Some in the back had begun to chuckle. Some had already started laughing. Those further down were still engaged in their own conversations, unaware of what horror lurked behind them. They just sat in their little peer circles, chatting and living their lives free of the overwhelming stress surrounding me like a cloud. How I envied them. "Look at all the voters you're not going to get, Four Eyes," Marcus said, but I continued to ignore him. As Miss Cunningham mounted the stage, the laughter had already begun in the back. She ignored it, opened the proceedings with a little speech before introducing Marcus to scattered applause. Marcus grinned at me, mouthing that I should watch how it's done before mounting the podium and starting his speech. He got straight to the point. Students wanted more free periods and fewer assemblies that served no purpose. They wanted more pep rallies and car washes, and less information about booster meetings and boring stuff. He said nothing, but he said it well, and he kept it short, so the students would remember it. The applause were scattered again. The laughter in the top row was taking on that mechanical sound that made my sanity scream from the depths of my skull. There were more of them now, the house lights dimming in the dark of the upper bleachers. and the darkness was spreading. Miss Cunningham had to call my name several times before I finally stood up and made my way to the podium. Marcus's grinning face welcomed me from the front row, smiling and inviting me to begin my pathetic speech. I had forgotten my papers, my meticulously crafted note cards, but it hardly mattered. I could no more have read them at this point than I could have spoken Russian. From the podium, I could see the black tar monsters crawling over the crowd, working their way down and bringing the inky darkness with them. The student body needs a person who will represent them, represent their interests on the council. I feel that I heard the rattling of stuttered laughter, and it threw me off even worse. I feel that I can. My eyes were as big as dinner plates. They were smiling at me from within the crowd. Their 2 white teeth were horrifying. Their teeth, too large for their mouths. How did they contain all those teeth? How did they... Mrs. Cunningham was walking towards me, and I'm not sure if she was trying to save me from the shame of making a fool of myself on stage, or she was angry that I had wasted her time. Regardless, she only got about halfway across the stage when she smirked and began to chuckle. I watched her, terror written across my face, as she doubled over and began to erupt in racking gales of full-body laughter. There was laughter behind me, too. The torpor was becoming a single note of canned and emotionless chuckles as it spilled from throats that were no longer their own. I glanced to the side and saw Marcus doubling up, his fingers dragging over his eyes and cheeks and leaving bloody tails behind. The mob was laughing, their laughter dead in uniform, and I felt my sanity unraveling a strand at a time as I backed away from the crowd. My foot found empty air, and I felt the wind knocked out of me as I fell off the stage. Miss Cunningham was tearing at her clothes as she laughed her life away. I scooted backwards, getting my feet under me and running as that terrible laughter chased me. It's the kind of laughter you hear bubbling from the windows of an insane asylum. It's the kind of laughter you hear in hell. I ran then. Ran until I found a door and barreled through it as the maniac drone chased after me. I ran until the school doors opened before me and I was out on the quad, my sneakers making for home. I ran and I ran, the pavement the most substantial thing I'd felt all day. I ran until I found myself on the porch of my house. I banged on the door until my mother opened it, confusion and anger stamped big across her face. Then I collapsed, and I didn't come back to reality for 3 days. When I did, I was in the hospital. That's where I got the whole story from my bleary-eyed mother, who hadn't left my bedside the entire time I'd been here. Everyone in the gym was dead. The police were calling it a gas leak, and the whole city was mourning the loss of so many young people. The doors had been wedged shut, all but the ones I had burst out of. School officials had found everyone inside dead from hyperventilation, including Miss Cunningham. Some had tried to claw their eyes out, had peeled their faces open, but all had succumbed to this terrible tragedy. I said nothing. My sister came to visit, apologizing for how she had hurt me, and extremely thankful that I had been late that day. My mother was suddenly the doting woman I had always wanted. She and my sister were never far from my side, and their attention quickly became claustrophobic. I soaked it in as long as it lasted, though, never wanting it to end. I would never tell anyone about what had happened that day. They all assumed that my lateness had led to my safety, and they would never believe me if I told them the truth. That was 10 years ago. I live on my own now. I have it all. An apartment, a girlfriend, a mediocre job, the whole experience. My mom and sister still call to check on me often. My dad is the same old ambivalent person he always has been, and it's heartwarming to have their love after years of feeling like an outcast in my own home. I felt I had gotten over the event. I felt that I had put it behind me. I don't talk about it outside of therapy, and I like to think that it may make me stronger for having lived through it. My girlfriend knows nothing about it, of course. She knows I had something traumatic happen in my past, but she knows I've moved on, and the less I say about it, the better it is for my mental health. At least, I had gotten over it. Yesterday I received a letter in the mail, a letter from my old high school, a letter for a high school reunion. I looked at the postcard, a glossy picture on the front, and the words on the back with the banner proclaiming, "Welcome back, class of 2010. The front was a picture of the gym as it had been on the day of the event. On the floor was gathered the smiling creatures as they waved and grinned their eternal grins. On the back was written 3 words that sent chills down my spine even now. See you soon.
Mr. Carlson, they want you on stage, sir. Roger Carlson looked up from his reflection in the mirror and turned to look at the young woman in the doorway.
How do I look? He asked, smiling hugely as he fixed her with his regard. She flushed a little.
You look great, Mr. Carlson. I was hoping I could get an autograph, if it's not too much to ask.
The young woman looked flushed as she held out the paper. Roger grinned as he took it, scrolling his name across the front before handing it back to her. She took it shyly, sliding a lock of brown hair behind her ear. Another fan, of course, but Roger was used to them by now. He'd been signing autographs for the last 10 years, but this was the first one that he had actually earned. No more raunchy Roger, or audience of drunken frat boys. He was done with that now. All of that was behind him. Maybe now he could bask in the light of honest fans who weren't just here for the juvenile humor. Maybe now he could do some serious work, something they would take seriously. So, what'd you think of the movie?
Oh, it was okay. I've been a fan of you for a while, though. I used to love your stand-up.
That took him back a little. The general consensus from female viewers had always been pretty negative. Raunchy Roger had been beloved by stoners and drunks, and his humor had followed suit pretty well. The character had been great when he'd been doing stand-up, and it had followed him through the last 7 years as the studio he worked for pumped out dumb movie after dumb movie. Raunchy Roger Goes to College, Raunchy Roger Private Eye, Raunchy Roger and the Booby Trap, on and on and on. He wasn't used to girls telling him they liked his work. She looked like she wanted to say more, but at that moment the band picked up and she flushed, looking a little flustered.
I think they're playing you on. Knock 'em dead, she said. Roger gave her a wink and walked towards the stage.
The crowd erupted into applause as he came out, and Roger basked in the warm regard as he walked towards the couch. The manager had been adamant about him doing this talk show circuit. Guy David was his first stop, and if he made a good impression here, he could keep making the rounds and pumping his new movie. This was no raunchy Roger flick either. He had starred in a serious movie for once, and he needed it to do well. He desperately needed to move out from under the shadow of raunchy Roger. Guy came out to shake his hand, and as he sat, he heard a chorus of male voices yelling, "Raunchy Roger!" from the back row. He gave them a polite wave and turned his attention to Guy. "Here on my couch tonight, we have a real legend in the world of comedy. Raunchy Roger himself, Roger Carlson, everybody." The applause were twinged with some boos this time, but Roger felt it was the same level of appreciation as before. "Thanks, Guy. It's a pleasure to be here. So you went from starring in a series of B-list movies that appealed to college kids and habitual drunks to starring in a major box office smash. What's that like, Roger?" Guy's teeth gleamed whitely in the overheads, and Roger felt almost blinded. Guy wore the same dark blue suit he always did. His graying hair swooped back in one of those Johnny Carson imitation doos that he had worn since the first show. Guy was a relic. He had been on his shows since the late 70s, and he showed no signs of going anywhere. Roger imagined that there was probably a girl or two in the wings getting ready to snipe his career, but maybe she would wait until he was done with his interview if he was lucky. "It's been an amazing ride, Guy, to go from doing something like Raunchy Roger to starring in a big Hollywood picture like Carter's Promise. The crew I worked with was amazing, and it was an honor to work with the beautiful Margot Thames." A wolf whistle came from the back, and the crowd laughed. "Speaking of Miss Thames, you two appear to have some real chemistry on screen. Anything there with you two?" The crowd made some oohing noises, but Roger ignored them. "That's called acting, Guy. I can assure you that while Miss Thames is a lovely woman, there is absolutely nothing romantic between us." That had been by design. Roger had been lying in a bathtub in New Mexico last year, mostly filled with his own vomit, and had looked up stuporously to see his agent, Claude, sitting on the toilet, with a long, suffering look, and puke drying on his shirt. Roger had been time-traveling again, which was what he called it when he got blackout drunk, and he had been hitting it hard last night. He had come out of his stupor quick enough when Claude had told him that he'd been giving him CPR for the last 10 minutes. That was a wake-up call. "You need to sort yourself out, Roger. I'm tired of hauling your ass out of the fire. I'm your agent, not your mother. The next time you decide to self-destruct, don't drag me down with you." Roger had cried, tears cutting through the grime and puke, and Claude had put a hand on his shoulder. "Let me help you, Raj.
Let me help you get out of this loop. Claude had dropped him off at rehab the same day. After 6 months of puking and shaking and going to countless meetings, he felt like he might be getting better. After 6 months, he had been ready to leave and see if he could maintain this new sober life of his. He had made a promise to himself in rehab, a promise that he would do better. Raunchy Roger was not the cause of his problems, but he was a symptom. Raunchy Roger liked to party. Raunchy Roger liked to sleep with anything with a pulse. Raunchy Roger liked to abuse prescription medication. And if he was going to get his life back together, he had to cleave from Raunchy Roger. When Claude had come to him with a script for Carter's Promise, he had made it clear that he couldn't Roger up the set. Rogering up something was a word Claude had used for ruining it, and Roger had agreed. He had drank nothing stronger than orange juice and water, kept up his workout routine, and put nothing stronger than aspirin in his body since coming out of rehab. A set would have access to the things from his past. Working on a set again would be the real test of his mettle. In the 8 months of shooting, he'd been tempted, but he had not succumbed. He was sitting here now, a better man. This is quite a transition for you, isn't it? From doing something like Raunchy Roger to a serious film like Carter's Promise. Roger realized he'd been wool-gathering and snapped out of it. It's been quite a change, but a change for the better, he said, smiling out at the crowd. They didn't clap this time, and that seemed a little off-putting. So, Glenmere Studios hasn't issued any statements on when their next Raunchy Roger movie will come out. Can you give us any insights? Roger furrowed his brow. Of course, this is why they wanted him here. As far as I know, the series is canceled. The last film will be the end of them. Several people in the audience made displeased noises, but somewhere in the back, someone laughed. It was an odd sound amongst the discomfort, and Roger found himself looking for whoever had made it. He was used to people laughing at him, but it sounded so alien at that moment. It sounded not altogether real. Guy seemed shocked. After all this time? We're talking about a series that's been going on for 7 years. Yes, well, now I'm moving on. I think we can finally put the character to rest. In the low rumbles from the crowd, he heard that laughter again. It was subtle, maybe 1 or 2 people, but it rankled him. He searched again for the source, but couldn't see anything. The house lights were always down when someone was on stage, and it made a murky soup out of the audience. The lights in his eyes didn't help matters either, and he found himself squinting against them. Well, out of respect for the recently deceased, maybe you can give us some classic Raunchy Roger lines? Guy asked, looking at the audience who began to clap like a bunch of sheep. Roger felt like screaming. Claude had told him this interview was all about the new movie, not his past. He didn't even want to think back on those drunken days when Roger had ruled his life, but it seemed to be all anyone wanted. The crowd was actually laughing now, cheering and egging him on, but the grating laughter still lingered amongst them. It was like an ice pick against his temple, that mechanical laughter that skittered through the crowd too fast to be discovered. They quieted down when he didn't laugh along with them, or stand up to oblige. I don't think so, Guy. I'm here to talk about Carter's Promise, not to rehash old material. He tried to ignore that grating chuckle, but it was becoming harder and harder to keep his cool. Oh, come on, just a few bits. What about the priest and the communion wine? I know that always makes me chuckle. How about it, folks? They applauded, but Roger barely heard them. All he could hear were the snickers, the chuckles, those mean little titters from the lips of fools. Look, I appreciate how many of you are fans of Raunchy Roger, but that's not me anymore. That's a part of my life I'm trying to put behind myself. I just want to forget about it and move on to more important things. A chuckle rumbled up from the audience, not altogether the artificial laughter he'd been hearing, and Roger felt his temper flare. I told the studio I wasn't going to do it anymore, okay? I'm a real actor now, he shouted. The back of the house bubbled with canned laughter, and Roger thought he saw people standing up in the back row. Were they smiling? They moved up to the next row, blackness swirling in that tepid sea of shadows that threatened to take in the next row of people. The scowling faces in front of them seemed to melt into smiles, their sudden laughter joining the rising din from the back of the house. They were laughing. They were laughing at him. Roger had been laughed at all of his life, but this was the first time it truly made him furious. I'm glad I did it too. I killed Raunchy Roger. He was made of the worst, darkest parts of me, and I'm glad he's dead. Roger shouted at the crowd, rising up from the couch and stalking towards them. He balled up his fists. They couldn't come and hear about his new project. They all had to pick the meat off the carcass of his old work. They wanted to hear the joke about the lesbian sisters, the nun who moonlighted as a dominatrix, the menacing priest he had barely escaped in his youth, and all those raunchy Roger classics that had transcended his stand-up and made it onto screen. Roger, you maybe should calm down a little. I'm not doing it anymore. Do you hear me? I'm not dancing for your amusement. Raunchy Roger was a misogynistic prick, a cancer that had to be removed. I'm a better person now. The crowd erupted into a flurry of canned laughter. They were really laughing at him now. They were mocking his suffering. They were mocking his journey. He had escaped a life that meant to kill him, and these assholes were mocking him. They didn't have the slightest idea what it was like to live under the shadow of Raunchy Roger. They didn't have a clue what it felt like to step out from under that weight. I'm a real actor, he screamed, not some clown that struts about to make you laugh at his antics. I moved on. Maybe you should move on too. But the closer he got to the crowd, the more he noticed them change. The blackness tore through them like a disease, and what had begun in the back was now rioting through the middle and working its way to the stage. The crowd, buried in that hazy blackness, grinned at him with two wide smiles and two white teeth. They leered at him, jumping seats and coming forward in a horror movie shuffle of propelled bodies. Roger backed away a step, almost tripping on the rug that stretched over the stage. He could hear the canned laughter ripping through the whole studio, and one of the band members began to chortle even as Roger backed away. The chortler fell over suddenly, his drum set falling with him, and he convulsed as the laughter was ripped from him and became the same mirthless screech that ran through the crowd. Guy began to giggle behind his desk, the laughter bubbling up painfully as Roger turned to run. The tide of laughter oozed behind him, and he ran for the exit door as fast as he could. He bumped into the pretty receptionist who had wished him luck, already doubling over as her skin began to mottle and run, and Roger felt fear move his feet as he charged for the door. He hit it like a fullback, but bounced off as the door refused to open. He slammed into them again and again, but they wouldn't budge. He turned, running down the hall for the side door, but the laughter was already coming up that way too. He was trapped. He had nowhere to go. He had to get out of here, and he saw the broom closet and dived inside. He sat amongst the mops and cleaning implements, his back against the wall, with a mop handle stuck under the door to keep it shut. Outside, he could hear things moving, hear their laughter as they got closer and closer. He dug his phone out and tried 911. He had to get some help. Someone would surely come to help him. The number rang and rang, and after 12 rings, Roger hung up. He called the police, called the fire department, and finally called his manager, Claude. Claude picked up on the third ring. Roger, what's wrong? You're supposed to be on stage. Claude, something's going on in the studio. People are trying to attack me. I need help. He trailed off. What did he need? You? Who would be trying to attack you? You're Raunchy Roger, he said, laughing a little as he said it. Everyone loves you. Why would anyone care enough to hurt someone like you? He broke into laughs between every word, his laughter cutting and jagged as it seemed to tear his throat apart with its intensity. He howled like a beast on the other end of the phone, and Roger could imagine him gasping his sides as he laughed his life away, on and on. His laughter sounded like the lunatic chorus you hear out the asylum window. It sounded like the laughter Roger imagined you'd hear in hell. The voice that came back on the phone was very different. It was liquid, oily, but still recognizable. It was a voice he knew as well as his own. How many times had he cultivated it on stage? How many nights had he talked to himself in just that voice? Roger found himself talking to Raunchy Roger, and the realization made him shudder. Why would anyone care if you lived or died, you stupid hack? They all want me, Raunchy Roger. No one gives a crap about whatever little movie you're managing to spew out. You might as well come out and embrace it, bucko. I'm not going anywhere. His voice was backlit, overpowered, drowned out by the laughter that suddenly bubbled up from the phone, and Roger sat against the wall as the laughter on the phone matched the laughter approaching the door. He suddenly snorted and covered his face with his hands. He couldn't help it. Something about this situation was suddenly just so damn funny.
"They're ready for you, Doctor," Nurse Chastain said as she stuck her head through the double doors. Dr. Clyde didn't look up from his wash sink, where he stood mentally preparing himself for the coming surgery. Dr. Clive, just docked to the nurses in his OR, started every surgery by reminding himself that he was the hand of God, sent to cure the sick and heal the living. He was God's instrument, and he must help those in need so that he might fulfill his purpose. He finished his cleansing ritual and stepped through the same double doors the nurse had just exited. The gleaming surgical suite was awash with men and women garbed for surgery. The nurse stepped forward, gowning and gloving Clive as he stepped closer to the table. The trays were laid out just so, the breather nearby, his patient prepped and ready. Clive took a moment to glance up at the theater seating around the top of the sunken operating room and saw Steiner and Merkel, along with a few curious onlookers, sitting and observing as he began. Then he cast his gaze still higher as he basked in the radiance that flowed down from God like manna from heaven, coming through the glass ceiling above the gallery. St. Mercus Hospital was one of the few hospitals in the country with an operating theater. The administration thought it was good for business, letting guests who desired witness surgeries beyond anything they could ever imagine. The tagline for the operating theater was, "Come see God's miracles daily," on the promotional materials, and Dr. Marcus Clive was the chief performer of those miracles. He made eye contact with Dr. Steiner and had to remind himself not to wink at him. He was above such baser gloating, even if it would really get Steiner's goat. He knew as well as Steiner did that it was a prestigious honor to operate here, an honor granted only to Clive these days. He had never had a surgical mishap, never lost a patient, and had no black marks to his name. They had called him a prodigy at Johns Hopkins, just like his father. Unlike his father, he had not been snared by the bottle or by the lust of the flesh. He kept a clear head and was a dutiful spouse, unlike his father. "Unlike Gwendolyn," the voice of the serpent whispered. He shook that voice off. That was the voice of darkness. What do we have today?" he asked Nurse Breacher. "Male, Mr. David Gross, here for an aortic valve replacement, Doctor." Clive smiled behind his mask as he held out his hands for the scalpel. He could have done this procedure in his sleep. "That was inspired, Doc. I don't think I've ever seen a replacement go that smoothly." Clive washed his hands, closing his eyes as he spoke the ending of his mantra. "I think Dr. Steiner stayed for the whole procedure." He could almost see Nurse Beecher's smile as she spoke. She was leaning against the scrub sink, Clive just finishing washing his hands. The washing was how it always began, and how it always ended. It cleansed him, made him clean before the eyes of God. He looked down as he washed, but had to look away and keep scrubbing. The blood was so thick there, he had wallowed in it, been stained by it. God's instruments are often hard to clean after they've served his purpose. Some of us are going out for drinks. I wanted to know, if you'd like to come with us. She twirled her fingers through her hair when she said it, looking like some high school girl trying to figure out if a boy liked her or not. Clive had seen her look at him like that for the last few years, and it always made him uncomfortable. If she desired him, then it would be best that she never say. He was a married man. She wanted too much of him. Who was she to try and test his bonds with Gwendolyn? Who was she to test the will of God's? Her hand felt warm on his when she covered it as she sat on the wash sink. "I know things have been hard for you, Doc, but they could be better. We could..." He shook his hand away. I need to go." She turned away, hurt but not surprised. Next time," she said hopefully. He knew that time would never come. Steiner was waiting by the elevator, almost as if he were waiting for Clive. "Great show today, Doc. Really, great show," he said, flashing that huge toothpaste commercial smile of his. Clive had always been unnerved by that smile. Steiner looked like a doctor from a soap opera. Swooped back blonde hair, chiseled jawline, body by Bowflex, crammed under a white coat.
Many of the nurses lusted after him. Some of them had followed him to bed, but Clive had always felt uneasy around him. That mouth was too wide, his jaw threatening to unhinge like a snake when he talked. A mouth like that would swallow you whole, and he suspected that might be Steiner's plan for replacing him. Just swallow him whole, bones and all. Clive said nothing. He just pushed the down button as he prepared to leave for the day. "I talked to the board today, Clive. Mr. Mason doesn't think it's fair that you get to use the theater and no one else does." Mason's a godless fool, a Darwin worshipper who has no place inside these walls. Steiner smiled that too wide grin, and Clive had to stop himself from shuddering. "I'll be sure to tell him that." The door opened and Clive stepped inside, Steiner following after him. The door closed, locking the two of them inside this falling coffin. "Regardless, he's given me time in the theater next week. I've got a tricky bit of brain surgery that he thinks the public might like to see. It looks like you're not the star of the theater anymore." Clive scoffed, turning his stoic face into the oncoming leer. "I wish you well of it. May your efforts be to please and glorify God, and not simply to prop up your own damaged ego." His smile then became a real sneer. "That creepy, holier-than-thou-are bullcrap you spew isn't going to win you any favors here anymore. Daughtry and Morris are stepping down in a few months, and Simons will be gone by the end of the year. Clements is a weak-willed snail, and Mason will be free to move in some individuals with a less narrow outlook. Your days are numbered, Marcus." Clive didn't flinch from the sneer. Daniel never flinched within the lion's den, and certainly Steiner was no lion. He and Merkel could hover over him as he worked, but they'd gained nothing for their efforts. Clive was above the judgment of man. He answered only to God, and God's will would be done. "If that is the will of God, then I shall bow to it." Steiner scoffed. "You can use your God as a veil for your pompousness, but the rest of us can see what it really is. Pride cometh before a fall, Doc, and your fall will be long indeed from atop your high horse." When the doors opened, Steiner pushed past him and skulked out into the hospital at large. Clive let him get a dozen paces away before leaving for the parking garage. It was late afternoon, and the autumn leaves scuttled across the parking deck like skeletal rats. He walked through the rows of cars to the service elevator and took it down to the sub-basement. The maintenance men had looked at him like he was crazy when he'd asked them to put his spot down there, but Clive didn't want to park his BMW somewhere with high traffic. The car was his pride and joy, the first vehicle he had bought after becoming a doctor, and some days he felt like he loved it more than his wife. It was almost a decade old, but the chrome still shined, the paint was still immaculate, and the engine purred as if it had been the first day he'd driven it off the lot. The doors opened on the sub-basement, and Clive was pleased to see that his was the only vehicle here. He walked across the concrete tomb, one of the lights flickering overhead, and stood halfway to his car when he thought he heard the same skeletal scraping of leaves. He glanced around. Surely there were no leaves down here. No wind either, even if there were. He was 5 floors underground. The sound of his sensible shoes clocking on the pavement must have been what he heard. But as he started again, he stopped after hearing the same noise. It sounded strange in this place, but the noise sounded like laughter. Not real laughter. It was that false laughter that polite or rude people make sometimes. He had known people in his career who would laugh at any joke in just that way, if it came from the lips of a superior. It was false, a lie, and Clive had never stooped to such since becoming a man. He was still convinced that it must have been his shoes, the clump of his heels somehow making that sound as it bounced off the shadowy corners of the garage. But as he approached the car, he became less sure of it. As he approached his comfortable BMW, he could almost feel someone's eyes on him. That scuttling, skittering laughter blew like a wind across the pavement. He clicked the key fob as it got closer and closer, seeing the lights blink and hearing the cheery horn toot. He took a step towards the car, meaning to get in, then turned suddenly to confront whatever prankster thought they were funny. No one would scare him, whether it be in the light of day or the darkest tomb. He was God's instrument, an extension of his love and mercy, and he would not stand for being hounded by some cat's paw of Steiner's or Mercer or Mr. Mason himself. He turned and found no one behind him, just an empty garage and his uneasy breathing. He closed the door behind him as he climbed behind the wheel of his car. He felt comfortable behind the wheel. He felt in control again, and he pulled out his phone to check his messages before driving away. He had asked Gwendolyn if she intended to come to Mass with him tonight before going to wash for surgery. She hadn't gone to Wednesday Mass since the miscarriage. That had been a dark day for Clive, a dark day for both of them, but he had seen it as a sign that it wasn't time for him to have a child. When the time was right, God would bless him with one. Gwendolyn had taken it very differently, having a lapse of faith and a general stagnation of her relationship with God and the church. That had been a year ago, though, and it was time to get back in the Lord's good graces. It was time to stop all this dalliance and get back on the righteous path. Her response had been short. "Go without me. I have plans." Clive thought of asking who these plans were with. The gardener, her tennis coach, her fitness instructor, some stranger that she would drag into their marital bed to satisfy her lust. His fingers hovered over the buttons to do just that, but instead, he put the phone away and started the car. Gwendolyn would come back to the fold eventually. She would see the error of her ways, and he recoiled in his seat, his knees hitting the horn as his brain tried to make sense of what he had seen. There had been a face outside the window, an eyeless, inky black thing with grinning teeth and a too-wide mouth. That mouth reminded him a little of Steiner, and he felt his breath hitch in his throat as he looked back to confirm what was imprinted on his memory. It was gone, though, when he turned back. The only thing reflecting was his own haggard face. He shook his head. Maybe he'd been working too hard lately. Maybe all this was starting to catch up with him. Maybe it was time for a break, a chance to relax and reflect. He shook the thoughts away. God's instrument never rested. He pulled out of the parking garage and turned for St. Dominic's. He needed to bask in the glory of God before returning to the Sodom that his home had become. He arrived home just as the front door opened, and Gwendolyn walked out with her personal trainer. They were mooning at each other, hand in hand, and as they came onto the wide front porch, their hands slipped from each other's when they saw his car in the driveway. Clive had never bothered to learn the man's name. He was one in a long line of lovers that his wife had brought home over the past year. He didn't linger on the front porch. He said his goodbyes and was pulling out 30 seconds later. Clive prayed daily that wasn't the only pulling out that he was doing. He also prayed that she was being safe, if not smart. She was waiting for him on the porch as he sat in his car. Clearly she wanted to talk, to put his mind at ease, that they were just friends, or he was just here for his session, or some other excuse. He looked in the rearview mirror to be sure the man had left, and cringed away before turning to look in the back seat. He was panting as he scanned the back, eyes darting like a scared animal. The thing from the garage had been there, had turned and grinned at him, but now there was... He jumped, hitting his head on the ceiling as someone knocked on the glass. It was Gwendolyn. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice muffled by the glass. "It looked like something startled you." He killed the engine and stepped out of the car, sending his wife stepping back so the door didn't hit her. "I'm fine. I see your plans went well." She followed in his wake as he walked towards the house, timid and unsure. "Randy came over for a private session, since it's hard for me to make it to the gym these days." Clive commented as he walked into the house. "You're home early," she said awkwardly, as the two of them stepped into the grand old house that had once been Clive's childhood home. "Service ended at 8. It's now 8:30. I'm home exactly when I should be," Clive said icily. "You're the one who's late in sending your plans home," was what he wanted to say. She had made him a cuckold, and all he could manage was passive aggression with her. He paused in the entryway, looking into the living room where his father's chair still sat. He had allowed her to redecorate every room except for this one. The couches, the old photos, that canary yellow rug his mother had loved so much, and of course, the tan leather chair that his father had sat in every evening and nursed his tumblers of whiskey. How many nights had he played on that awful rug, careful to avoid his father as he drank and read his medical journals? How many evenings had he come home from school to find his father right there and already drunk as he pretended he could see straight enough to read the Evening Post? He could almost see his father's ghost slumped in that chair now as it turned its head to regard him, its lips peeled back in a too-wide grin. Clive buried the shutter so Gwendolyn wouldn't see it and think less of him. "Are you hungry? I've got dinner ready if you'd like to eat with—" "Not tonight," he said as he gave her a pointed look. "Something's turned my stomach, I'm afraid. I'll be in my study." He walked across the hall, leaving her standing there like a guest who's unsure of where to go. He was operating. His scalpel was a gleaming silver sword as he cut the cheeks of his patient. He cut and cut and cut until the face was one long smile that grinned eternally, even as the patient groaned beyond the haze of anesthesia. He looked up when he was finished, raising his arm to the gallery and finding it filled with the eyeless, smiling creatures. They clapped and capered like Satan's imps, and when he drew off his surgical mask, he could see that he too had a wide, carved grin that dribbled blood onto the sterile floor of his theater. The monstrosities clapped and clapped, and their laughter rang out hollowly through the theater, devoid of all mirth or joy. They laughed without knowing joy, and he reveled in their regard. The thunder outside woke him suddenly, and he sat up in bed. He was breathing heavily, the dream having rattled him, and the rain had started coming down some time after he'd gone to bed. He had kissed Gwendolyn dutifully good night, and gone to what had once been his marital bed. Now he slept there alone, her banished to a guest room until she was ready to make herself clean before God and confess her sins before Father McCormick. She said she wouldn't. It was no one's business but hers and God's, and Clive had rejected her, frankly, secular outlook on what was a shameful practice. The lightning made him jump, and when he looked at the window, he nearly screamed. Outside was one of the grinning abominations, clawed hands splayed against the glass, and rain dripping down his eyeless face. Clive stared at it, his heart feeling ready to leap up out of his chest, and the creature stared eyelessly back at him. The two stood in silence for a count of 30, before a bright flash of lightning dispelled it. When his eyes adjusted, it was as though it had never been there. Clive looked a mess as he came into the hospital the next morning. His scrubs were immaculate as always, but he hadn't had time to press his lab coat. His graying hair sprang up in cowlicks, and he was jumpy after a night spent with the eyeless creatures gazing at him. Every time he had managed to doze off again, he found himself back in that demonic operating theater, the gallery full of those waiting ghouls. He smiled at them in the dream and reveled in their regard, but beneath that facade, he was screaming. He woke up screaming more than once. Gwendolyn never came to check on him. She had likely taken a sleep aid and was catatonic in her bed. He had slept through his 6 a.m. alarm, and when he had come awake with the sun beating on his face, he had thrown himself out of bed in a blind fury. Now it was 9, and he was hours late for his rounds. Nurse Breacher was coming out of the elevator as he was getting ready to go up, and she seemed relieved to see him. "Doc, thank God. We were getting worried about you. Your 10:15 has been moved up to 9:15. They need the operating room at noon for some procedure with Dr. Steiner. Did you know he's been given authorization to use the operating room?" Clive climbed into the elevator beside her and pushed the button going down instead of up. He said as much yesterday. Nurse Breacher looked at him out of the corner of her eye as the elevator rumbled to the ground floor where the operating rooms were. You don't look so good, Doc. Are you okay?" "I had a rough night," he said, stepping out of the doors as they came open. The last thing he wanted to do was step into that operating theater that he had spent most of last night in, but the room was his domain, and he'd be damned before he'd let Steiner or those faceless boogeymen take it from him. Those words would prove prophetic. He hung up his lab coat, telling Nurse Beecher to get everything ready for his gastric debridement, and set about washing his hands. He spoke the words as he always did, a prayer to God to make his hands steady and his mind clear, but the words were muddled as that canned laughter from those creatures swept across his mind. He tried to dispel them, tried to exorcise them from his thoughts, but they just wouldn't go. He felt himself begin to cry, his tears falling into the sink as the warm water and soap ran to join them. He had gotten control of himself by the time Nurse Beecher returned. "They're ready for you, Doc," she said. He strode into the operating room and cast his eyes skyward. But the day was overcast, and it appeared that there would be no transplendent manna from heaven today. His eyes fell upon the gallery instead, and he sucked in a nervous breath as he saw them. Not the creatures, of course, but Snyder and Merkel and their dear sainted Mr. Mason were all sitting up there with a handful of guests and staff on break. They sat on high like a jury from God, judging him, trying to catch him slipping. He straightened himself and set his mind to rights. God's instrument did not slip. He made sure the patient was ready, a 55-year-old with a GI tract full of tumors, and began his first incision. He had opened the chest cavity, the room as silent as a church, when someone in the gallery laughed. Clive paused, almost dropping his instrument had it not been for the textured surgical gloves he wore, and put it out of his mind. The second chortle was worse. It sounded like fake laughter, like sitcom laughter, like the sitcoms Gwendolyn watched in the den sometimes that never appealed to him. He called for silence in the operating room and was elbow deep in the patient's abdomen when he heard the second laugh, a mirthless chuckle that rolled through the gallery like a dead leaf that sent his nerves skittering. "I said quiet in the gallery. If anyone else makes noise, I would like them..." But that's when Nurse Beecher suddenly started laughing. The woman doubled over, her face pressing against the unconscious patient, and sprayed laughter as the gallery rumbled above him. He looked up then, getting ready to yell at them, administrators or not, but he dropped his instrument and gaped at the assembled crowd. Steiner, Merkel, Mason, and numerous others were laughing like loons as the dark creatures sat patiently amongst them. One of the nurses, who had come on her break, suddenly leaned out over the rail and fell to the polished tiles below. She burst like an overripe fruit, dousing the machines and instruments in gore and sending the other nurses in the room into gales of laughter. Clive backed away, his breath hitching as their laughter became more and more mechanical. They lost that rosy laughter, their human mirth drained from them as they laughed their lives away. The laughter echoed off the walls, bouncing against the glass ceiling and ringing eerily throughout the operating theater. Clive put his hands to his ears, reminded of the time they had went to a mental hospital when he was in med school. The inmates had laughed just like that, laughing despite the horrors they lived in daily, and Clive had heard that laughter in his nightmares for weeks after. It was the laughter of the clinically insane. It was the laughter of those trapped in hell. Then the man on the table sat up, his guts spilling out as he chuckled and laughed, and Clive felt his bladder let loose as he turned to run. He made it to the wash-up room, his hip striking the sink and sending him spilling. But when he tried to push the door open, it wouldn't budge. He threw his body at it, his hip aching when he hit it, but the door would open for nothing. Clive finally slid down the unmoving portal and sat with his back to it, watching the shadows of those imps coming for him through the foggy glass of the doors beyond. He began to pray, hoping God would show him mercy. Maybe God even did. Who's to speculate on the merciful nature of God, after all? "What do you mean there's no second season?" The man who sat across from me was tall, his tweed sweater looking dumpy in my very trendy office. He smiled warmly from his hunched position, though. If you didn't know who you were looking at, you might believe you saw a shoe salesman, or a store clerk, or something much less grand than he was. The man held none of the charms a writer usually possesses, and none of the pomp of a playwright or a screenwriter. He was a very plain man, with a rather mad little grin on his face. He was, however, Frederick Matz, and that led me to attempt courtesy. "Just as I said, there's no second season." He sat back with the casual grace of one who is not delivering a serious matter unto his boss. When Fred smiled, I began to see how strained it looked. That smile had always been warm, if not a little plain, but now it looked more than a little crazed. There were dark circles under his eyes, and his fingers were continuously sliding over his cheek. He kept glancing at the corner of my office, and I looked to see what was so interesting, but saw nothing. His manic eyes kept darting, but I wasn't sure what exactly he was seeing. His behavior, unfortunately, wasn't so uncommon. We'd been working hard on this show of ours, hadn't we? The last 6 months had been nothing but revisions and reshoots as the need for them grew. Fred had been cloistered for nearly 6 days as he worked on the new script, and just as it seemed we might be ready, he was trying to back out. Now he was talking about walking away. Fred was talking about this as though it were nothing. Fred wasn't talking about trivial matters here. This wasn't the end of some pointless TV drama, some asinine action series that could just be replaced with one of the other countless shows on TV today. He wasn't talking about ending a low-budget TV show that barely reached 1,000 households, and he certainly wasn't telling me to take news upstairs that would result in me getting a pat on the back and a promotion. Fred was talking about canceling Falsty Review, the single most popular children's TV show on our station. He was talking about ending my goddamn career. Fred had made a submission about 2 years ago during an open call, and though I hadn't seen much in it, it had focus tested very well. Falsty Review was a show about an old theater, Falsty Hall, which had been purchased by a troupe of actors who were played by puppets. There was Mr. Gus, the director and playwright, and his actors, Miles, Judy, Clark, and Siegfried, a lion puppet. They were joined by their orchestra, various animal puppets, and the Meister, who had a magic baton. The baton would throw music notes onto the screen and lead the children in sing-alongs throughout the show. These were usually classical pieces, pieces of significance to the performance, and the show taught kids about music, composers, instruments, and various lessons about friendship and sharing and whatnot. The hall also had a ghost that lived there, and sometimes helped the troupe get through challenging performances by taking up much-needed instruments or roles on stage. On the surface, the show seemed ordinary, and not particularly original. The children, however, loved it. They adored Mr. Gus, the big-nosed puppet with the brushed mustache, and his ability to get through any situation. They loved Judy and Clark, the twins who loved each other despite being at odds almost constantly. They liked Siegfried, and his obnoxious growl could be heard from the arms of 500,000 viewers on the street as they hugged their white lion dolls to their chest and made it roar in jubilation. They liked the animal orchestra, all of them in their little tuxes and tails, that played the music. Above all, though, they liked the ghost that haunted Falsty Hall. Ghosts are almost always scary or off-putting for kids, but this ghost was helpful and seemed to like the acting troupe because they took care of the theater. She often helped them stop the bank director, a weasel-faced character named Miser Marcus. Miser Marcus was almost universally hated by the children. He was always trying to foreclose on the old theater, and every episode seemed to contain some scheme that he concocted so he could tear down the theater and use the land for houses or parking lots or something. The episodes usually ended with Miser Marcus being thwarted and the troupe celebrating their successful show. In the year it had been on the air, they had shot 20 episodes. Viewership on those episodes had been through the roof almost at once. It saw viewership higher than some primetime programs for a show that aired during their children's programming slot, and the network had liked the numbers it brought in. They liked them so much, they had even started playing it at 4 as well, so they could reach a wider audience. The Falsty Review toy line had been one of the best-selling toys this Christmas season, and they had started branching out into other areas as well. They had clothing lines available at most any retailer, hygiene items as well, and children's dinnerware that seemed to be impossible to keep in stock. The Christmas special, Christmas at Falsty Hall, had premiered during prime time and had been seen by over 1 million people. They had beaten out established Christmas specials on 3 other networks, quite a feat for a show that had only been on the air for a year, and the heads loved having such a show in their lineup. Now, this little man was telling me that there would be no more show, as if that was his decision. I leaned across my desk, giving him a hard look as I tried to make sense of what he was saying. Fred, you signed a contract for 30 episodes. Falsty Hall is only 20 episodes long as it stands. You owe us 10 more episodes, at the very least, to complete your contractual obligation. Fred kept grinning at me, but there was something in his face that didn't mesh with that smile. The smile didn't quite go all the way to his eyes, and his eyes looked worried. To hell with that, his eyes looked scared. My aunt had owned a horse when I was young, and I had seen one of them look just that way when a snake had blundered into its pen. Fred looked at me as though he was looking at his death, and it was either die or stomp it into the dust. Oh, I'm aware of my contractual obligation. Here. He slid a check across the desk to me, and I realized it was the advance we had given him on the first 25 episodes. I hadn't cashed it yet. I was going to wait until it was all done, but I can't do it anymore. I've changed my mind about the show. It has to stop. I could see the fear working in him, his eyes growing wide as they darted around the room. Was he high? What the hell was going on here? Is it another offer? Has Disney approached you? They may have Jim Henson Studios, Fred, but the puppeteers at Marco's Grotto are just as talented as... No. Well, I have had offers, but my contract is with you guys, and I intend to honor it. No, the show just has to stop now. If it goes on, I'm afraid of the consequences. I drew in a deep breath, cocking my head at Fred. Have you been threatened, Fred? He looked away, his eyes darting to the corner again. Not by anyone that you can save me from. I leaned across the desk again, fixing my face into something resembling understanding. I reached out to pat Fred's hand as he rested it on the desk. He threw them away and put them in his lap, but not before my own came away slick with sweat. He was perspiring buckets. His skin was clammy like a fish. I had worked with enough actors to know high when I saw it, and he was throwing up more red flags than a Super Bowl referee. Fred, are you okay? You seem very tense. Maybe there's a place we can take you for a little while. Some place where we can get you less tense. He seemed not to understand at first, but looked disgusted when it finally clicked home. I'm not on drugs. I don't need to clean out. It's the muses, okay? The muses want to lead the show in a direction that I'm not comfortable with. I lifted an eyebrow at him. The muses? You mean the puppets? The muses were strange, that was certain, but they were just puppets after all. There were 3 puppets referred to as the muses collectively. Their design was strange, almost like a shadow person the size of the rest of the cast. In every episode, there was a part where Mr. Gus would sit at his desk and think about that day's theater piece. He would unroll a piece of dry brown paper, like a scroll, and take up his father's quill as he started to write. He would hover it over the paper, hunched over his desk, waiting for the muses to inspire him. These 3 shadow creatures would scamper out onto the set, leaning close and seeming to whisper in his ear. Mr. Gus would and ah and make all the appropriate noises as he scribbled down the day's play or musical skit or piece of something or whatever was happening on that episode. The muses would leave just as he shouted, "Eureka!" and brought that day's plot back to the actors and orchestra. Despite how much the audience loved the other puppets, the muses had always focus tested poorly. Fred had insisted that they be part of the show, though. No muse plushie sat on a kid's bed, though, not unless it had been custom made. Kids did not like the muses. They found the idea of a shadow person who whispered into your ear scary. I had received letters from parents about how their children would have nightmares about the little creatures. One in particular from a guy in Canada who told me that he needed to take a double dose of his anxiety medication after tuning in just as they scampered on stage. Some trauma in his childhood or something, but letter writers usually shared a little more than you wanted them to. We had been after Fred to get rid of them since the pilot, but he had remained firm that they stay. It seemed he might have changed his mind now, though. Yes. Well, no, not really. See, the muses are based on my own muses. They came to me originally with the show's idea, and ever since, they've returned to help move it along. The part in the show where Mr. Gus sits down and they whisper in his ear is how they tell me the direction of the show. I kept my silence and let him continue. I had 2 theories going, but I wanted to let Fred finish before I decided which one I liked better. The first was that he was holding out on me for money. Fred knew that the show was doing very well, and he thought, he should have been paid more than he got. He wouldn't be the first, but we had a contract, and in showbiz, that's how things were done. The second theory, though, was a little less palatable. The second theory was that Fred had snapped, and hard. Well, lately, they want the show to go in a different direction. They want to add new characters, people I don't know, and when I try to refuse, they threaten to hurt me. New characters? The cast is pretty full, isn't it? We had a budget for 5 puppets, and we pretty well shot it and more with that animal band of yours. These new characters aren't puppets. I think they're real people. They want to add an actor to the group, like someone from TV, a comedian, a surgeon, a songwriter. I don't know who any of them are. They whisper to me about them, and I can't make them stop. It was almost horrific to watch Fred as he broke down. His face seemed to shift like there were bugs underneath it, and as he spoke, his fingers seemed like they wanted to pick at the skin around his face. Yeah, he definitely wasn't trying to haggle for more money. Fred was losing it quickly. Maybe this was salvageable. Maybe we could get Fred some help and put him back on track. We'd all been working long hours. I had done a few 12-hour days myself just last week, but Fred was clearly stressed, and it was affecting his judgment. Fred, let's be reasonable here. You're overworked, and it sounds like maybe not sleeping well. Why don't you take a couple of days off, clear your head, come back with a new... Fred nearly snarled at me, and he leaned forward so quickly that I pulled back, startled at the idea that he meant to bite me. There won't be any more. Don't you get it? I thought they wanted to help me. I thought they wanted to make my ideas into something great, but all they wanted was to use me. They want to use the show to get at kids. They want them hooked so they can take them and make them just like them. The muses want to make the kids like them? He buried his hands in his hair, and his face seemed to spasm between barely contained rage and a kind of crazed glee. Haven't you been listening? You have to cancel the show now. These new scripts, they aren't like the others. They're different. They want to reveal themselves to them. They want to make their play. But I won't be part of it. I won't have anything to do with people being turned into something like them. You can't put it on the air. You can't let them win. If this show goes on, the children will suffer. I had understood only one piece of information from all this rambling, and it gave me some small glimmer of hope. So you do have new scripts. He leaned away, now terrified of me, it seemed. His eyes darted to the corner again, and he seemed to realize that he had said too much. It seemed that Fred had been busy after all, while he was cloistered away in his study. It appeared he hadn't meant to drop that little factoid, but it had slipped out nonetheless. I shouldn't have Forget I said anything. I need to go." He pulled himself up, looking around for the door as he tried to make his escape. "You're under contract, Fred. If you have new scripts, they're under contract too. We'll need you to turn them in. They're our property, after all." "Never," he said, looking around frantically. "Never. You'll never get them. There will never be any more," he said, backing away as his eyes ping-ponged between the corners. I saw his eyes scooting around like a crazed animal, Fred looking for an exit, and when he found one, I got up and tried to stop him before he could make good on his threat. My office is on the 8th floor. All the offices up here have windows that are supposed to be shatterproof. They don't open. People in my line of work tend to bomb hard, and management didn't want anybody collecting their severance package from the sidewalk. I had a bird hit that window once, spilled coffee all over my keyboard in surprise when it did. It left a big red streak that I had to get after maintenance to clean for 3 days before a bucket truck came and cleaned it off finally. Fred proved, I guess, that the windows up here weren't so shatterproof. It was all very sad, a rising star who couldn't handle the expectation. I said as much at his funeral, bought a new suit just for the occasion. I stood behind the podium and told them how I had tried my best to talk him down, but he had made 2 things very clear that day in my office, and I meant to honor them to the last. He had told me that he couldn't take the pressure anymore, and that there was nothing I could do to stop him from killing himself. On that, he had been right. I could do something about the second, though. Fred had made it very clear that the show must go on, and with the last 5 scripts already on my desk, we would see that Fred's legacy lived on. It was the least we could do for our dearly departed Fred.